everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. This is Nicole with Topaz, and I'm very excited to have Hal Schmitt here with us. Hey, Hal.
Hi, Nicole.
He is here to present Mastering Topaz DeNoise. This is the beginning of our 2 weeks of DeNoise expertise. We're just going to be doing a lot of DeNoise webinars, and I'm really excited about it. This particular one is about building an effective and efficient workflow using DeNoise. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about Hal. Hal is the lead instructor and director of light photographic workshops in Los Osos, California. He instructs all levels of photography, Lightroom, and Photoshop, and has tons of different workshops and photo tours. Goes to all of these incredible places that I'm jealous about. And if you want to learn more about the light photographic workshops, you can go to lightworkshops.com and learn about the school that he teaches at. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Hal, and let's get started.
Okay, well, thank you, Nicole, and Topaz for having me back. It's been about 18 months, I think, since we did one of these before. So excited to talk to everybody about really one of my favorite plugins, and that is Topaz DeNoise. Before I get into the overall presentation, I just want to talk about noise real quick, and that before we start, there really is no one right answer for what level of noise is acceptable within your image. Ultimately, it's up to everyone as that individual photographic artist to figure out how much noise is acceptable. Because as you'll see, as we go through some of the processing, you're going to make some trade-offs. You can remove noise, but we lose other parts of the image. So when you look at your overall noise removal, I'd like you to think of the primary issue being, what are you going to use that image for? Because depending on how you display your image, you may not need to do as much noise reduction as you perhaps would if you're printing something very large. If you are showing most everything on a monitor, a bright backlit display, it's amazing what you can get away with. So you don't need to do as much noise reduction. If on the other hand you're starting to do a lot of printing, high quality large printing on some type of photo paper that really doesn't allow you to hide any of the issues in an image, then you're going to need to do more of the noise reduction. So it's always kind of a give and take as to what you want to do for noise reduction versus detail retention, and the deciding factor for that is how we're going to display the image. So that's kind of the overall blanket statement, and now I'll start getting in and taking a look a little bit at DeNoise. So I'm going to launch everything today just as a basic starting point from Lightroom. So I'm in the Lightroom library module here in the grid view, and it doesn't really matter how we get over to DeNoise, but if you do happen to go through Lightroom or go through the bridge in Adobe Camera Raw, there is one step that I would like you to do when you're building that workflow, and that is we know that most of our raw converters have some defaults associated with them. So I'm going to click on to just a picture of a whale tail, and this is one that I have used in a DeNoise tutorial before. I'm going to show something just a little bit different today than I did before. But when I take this image over to the Develop module inside of Lightroom, and this would be exactly the same thing with Adobe Camera Raw, I want to pay special attention to the Detail tab. Now that Detail tab for me is my preparatory step before I send the image off someplace else. There are some other things that we can look at, and I'll get to those on another example image in just a moment, in terms of overall workflow, things I might want to do before I go to DeNoise. But one thing that I find absolutely critical is going into your Detail tab and turning off any input sharpening that might have been applied by default. Now, sharpening and noise reduction are more or less two opposite things. Sharpening is looking to enhance edge contrast and texture detail, and noise reduction is in fact going to minimize some of that as it's looking to even out some of the tonal differences present in luminance noise. So I like to go in and take my sharpening amount, turn it off completely. Now there are a lot of different opinions and workflows out there as to what I do first, noise reduction or sharpening, input sharpening that is. I'm a big believer in going in first and turn it off, the input sharpening. I'll take care of noise reduction if I need to, and then go back and add in relevant detail to edges and texture sometime later. Now below the sharpening, most of your raw converters are also going to give you some type of noise reduction. Now out of those two types, we have the luminance noise as well as color noise. I like to turn my luminance noise down to 0, but I do leave the color noise at the default of 25. I think that gives me a nice starting point when I launch off to DeNoise from this point here. If you don't want to make these slider adjustments every single time, I highly recommend you go in and, regardless of what raw converter you're using, create a preset. If you notice over here on the left side of my screen, I have a denoise prep. What this is it sets all of my detail sliders to this exact configuration here, turning off input sharpening, turning off luminance noise reduction, and leaving the color noise reduction right at its default. I can click this, and then I'm ready to go. So that is one step that I like to do before I send anything over to denoise. I'll talk about the overall workflow in terms of what type of adjustments do I want to make tonally after we look a little bit at denoise itself and see some basic workflow. So I'm going to take my image here, and I could launch from Lightroom. I could right-click and send straight over to denoise via Fusion, but for a few extra options, I instead like to skip that and go over to Photoshop. I highly recommend launching your images from wherever you may be into Photoshop first and then launching the plugins, and you'll see why that is here in just a few minutes. So when I bring the image up into Photoshop, I kind of want to demonstrate just first. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. And as you make the image smaller, it's not really that apparent how much noise there is in this image. And this reinforces that discussion we had earlier about how am I going to use the image. If my final presentation of this whale tail is something about this size on a bright backlit monitor, I might not need to do anything else. But if I'm going to take this on a monitor and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, so I'll push it up to something like a fit view inside of Photoshop, okay, noise is becoming a little more apparent. I might be able to get away with this. If, however, I want to make the most critical assessment, I could zoom into a one-to-one view. And that's where I see that noise really is a problem in the image. So before you start that noise reduction process, think of how you're going to use the image. How much of this noise here, and we can see a huge amount of it inside the tail, the water, everything else, how much of that do I need to get rid of? When I'm in Photoshop, if I go up and straight away launch Topaz DeNoise, I know that I'm going to work basically on my background layer. So I always like to go in first and make sure that I have a copy of the layer. And this is going to serve me well for a couple of different reasons. So I will just use a keyboard shortcut. I'm going to use Control-J on Windows, Command-J on the Mac, and that's going to duplicate my background. I believe in always giving every new layer a name that is meaningful, assuming I can spell here. So I'll just call it DeNoise. That way I know now and in the future exactly what this layer's done. With that, from here, I can go up and launch my appropriate filter, coming down to Topaz, and DeNoise. Now before we look at the workflow, I do want to talk for just a couple moments about the basic interface itself, as we'll be moving around this quite a bit. Over on the left side, what I like to call the left panel, I put everything more or less in Lightroom terms. So over here we have the left panel, which is showing me all of my presets and preset information. In the center of the display is what I like to call my content area, where this gives me a preview of the noise reduction that I'm going to apply. Now over on the right side, I call this the right panel. And the right panel contains a lot of stuff for me. I up top have a little navigator, a couple of other options for preview modes. And then down at the bottom, I have all of my controls. And these are the controls here: noise reduction, detail recovery, debanding. These are the places that really give me all the power and beauty of denoise if you want to get into the weeds and go in and figure out exactly how to tweak things perfectly. When I launch, initially, I'm going to launch into a 200% view. I can see that by looking right below the navigator. I prefer to do most of my noise reduction. In fact, I like to do most of my critical work on the images at a 1-to-1. So I will just click the small 1-to-1 tab, showing me a little bit more of the image. The first stage in my workflow is to move that image around so that I'm looking what I consider the critical area. And on something like this, for me, that critical area is the whale tail itself. The noise on the dark portion of the fluke, that is the most distracting to me. So I will put that into a 1-to-1 view right here in the center of the content area, and then we can start the process. Now, as I said a moment ago, everything over on the right, noise reduction, detail recovery, debanding, this is the true beauty and power of the DeNoise plugin. But fortunately, we don't have to use all of those every single time based on what I consider a very, very simple workflow, which is preset driven. DeNoise is a very preset friendly program in that over on the left side, I have a series of plugins or presets from JPEG Light all the way down to raw strongest with debanding, and each of these are a collection of saved settings. I don't need to know really anything else about the program. All I can do is go in and choose one of these presets, and automatically everything over on the right panel is going to be applied to my image. I think the presets can serve us one of two ways. For some of y'all, they might serve in the first manner, and that is they're just a click and play. That is, I find something that I think might work. I'll, for example, come right here to raw strong, click. That's going to be applied to the image, and I can see that, yes, I've reduced the noise significantly here inside of the whale fluke. So the first way we could use the program is simply by clicking a preset. If we like what we see, come down to the bottom right, hit OK, and we're finished with our noise reduction. I love that. And for about half the images that I work on, that's all I need to do. So when I have a program that is this powerful, giving me access to these amazing plugins, I love just being able to click and play and say, you know what, that's perfect, I can move on. Now every single plugin every preset that I click is going to set different things within all of my controls and sliders and tools over here on the right panel. So the second way I can use a preset is use it as a starting point. Once I click the preset, I can see what I get inside of the image, and then I can go over to the right panel and tweak as much as I need to get exactly what I want. So what I'd like to show out of this image here is just a couple of controls that I think you might find useful, and you're going to have to call on them every now and again. When you choose a preset, the basic rule of thumb with choosing presets is start with the lowest amount of noise reduction that you think you can get away with. As I said earlier, it's always a balance. When I reduce noise, I'm also going to subtly begin to reduce detail in my image. So you need to find that balance of retention of detail and noise reduction. The easiest way we can do that, I think, is you start at the weakest preset, if you will. Now this is coming over as a raw file, so I'd go straight to raw lightest. So that's the smallest amount in terms of a preset that I get. If I want to see a before and after, we get a great few ways to do that. My favorite is bringing the mouse right here into the center of the content area, click, and as I click before and after, I'm not really seeing a huge amount. So I know that I've got to go a little bit stronger. And I just step right through the presets. That is my workflow. It goes relatively fast. So I click through, start saying, okay, when is it that I'm seeing a true reduction in the noise? Okay, there I'm really starting to see it. At raw moderate, I can go before and after, and things are starting to look a little bit better. Now for this image, I'm going to pretend that my ultimate use for this is I'm going to make a big print of it. And when I make a big print, I'm going to put that up on the wall. I want to have a lot of people right up next to it. So even this level of noise reduction isn't going to work for my display purposes. So I'll continue this down. Maybe go into raw strong. And I notice that I'm reducing noise, but at the same time, I am reducing a little bit of the detail within the image. My whale tail is becoming more illustrative and a little bit less photographic. And to some degree, that's just the nature of the beast here inside of noise reduction. There are ways that we can overcome that, though, using DeNoise itself, as well as a couple of other Topaz plugins that we'll look at here in just a few moments. Now, I think I'd like to go just a little bit further in this image, so I'm going to take it from raw strong to raw stronger. And now I see at raw stronger a tremendous amount of noise reduction, but I'm also seeing some other things going on in the image. One thing that you might be noticing, in addition to a slight illustrative feel, is that right here in the center of the whale tail, what before noise reduction is relatively a black area, a very dark tonal region. After noise reduction, because of some of the algorithms that are in play, I start to see a little bit of a reddish tinge to this area of the image. That's something that I can probably take care of either here inside of the right panel. If you don't want to get into those sliders, though, I will show you an alternate method to take care of that, so you don't ever have to go in and work sliders if you don't want to. So once I have a preset that is my starting point, I like to go and take my left panel and hide it by clicking that small arrow. This way I can concentrate on the content area, get a little bit more of the image into my display so I can see what I'm doing. Using a preset as a starting point, I can then go in and over on the right side, using those right panel controls, change anything that I'd like. Now, you'll see a lot of different discussions regarding the preview mode as you do this, whether I can work in the RGB, luminance values, color, reds, blues. In most cases, I like to work in just the basic normal RGB mode. Why is that? Because I'm a guy, I process things in color. What I'm looking at is ultimately going to be close to my finished product, and although luminance values might do a nice thing in removing color and removing some distractions, they don't tell me the full story. For example, if I'm looking at this image inside of a luminance display, what I'm going to miss is all of this red that has now been introduced. So I'm thinking in RGB because this is a color image. I like to keep it right there. Now the auto brightness controls, if you want them, you can certainly use that. These are very beneficial if you have images that are relatively dark and you haven't done anything to the tonal range before then, because sometimes that noise is going to hide down there in the shadows, and if I turn on that auto brightness, I'm going to get an artificial increase in the tonality of the image so I can see the noise more easily and then go in and make the adjustments with both presets as well as the controls on the right panel that I'm looking at right here. So the individual controls that I'd like to talk about real quick, things that you're going to use often. Once you've selected a preset as a starting point, coming into the basic noise reduction tab, this overall strength slider, right up at the top, that one is something that you might tweak every now and again. The overall strength slider is just that. It controls the power of the algorithm, the noise reduction algorithm, across the entire image. So if you think that, you know, I like this preset, but I want a little bit more or want a little bit less, feel free to go in and tweak that overall strength slider. Now, adjust shadow. I don't find that I use that too often, but we will look at it in the next image, or in one of our next images. Adjust highlights, we'll talk about that as well, where I can either add or reduce some of the relative noise reduction based on tonality. The next slider down, though, is one that I think you'll end up using every now and again, along with its, I'll call it companion slider, and this is an adjust color red, adjust color blue. And what these sliders do is that they change the level of noise reduction to the red channel relative to the overall strength of what's going on in your noise reduction. Long explanation. So what do they really do for me? I like to think of these as when I move the adjust color red slider to the left, and this is not the technical thing that's going on here, but it's a great way to understand what these do. Adjust color red slider all the way to the left, it's almost as if I'm leaving the red where it is or possibly adding a little bit. When I move that adjust color red slider to the right, I'm going in and using this slider, DeNoise is going to look for those areas that are reddish-based color noise, and it's going to add the opposite color in an attempt to remove those. So you could think of it in a very, very basic terms, and this is not the exact technical nature of what's happening, but you can think of it as going in and selectively adding green to remove some of that red. Now, in an image like this, where I've had a little bit of this color bleed, there's my before, there's after, so I get this introduction of red. This is a great place I can go with that adjust color red slider and move it over to the right. And I'm just going to set it at 0 at first and see if we can notice a difference there. That's pulled back quite a bit of that red. I'm going to take it just a little bit further. And now I've pulled out arguably almost too much because I'm starting to get a little bit of a green hue right here into the center of the whale's fluke. But you can see how that slider works. When we apply the overall noise reduction and you get some type of blending and mixing of color or even an introduction of color you didn't anticipate, if it happens to be in the basic red hue or the basic blue hue, we can go in and use these two sliders to tweak that preset and try and fine-tune our color as best we can. So these are two that I find myself going to relatively often, and I'll just move in and tweak until I get the exact amount of color or the lack of color that I want in something that shouldn't have it or did not have it originally inside of my base image. So there's a couple sliders that I like to use quite often. Overall, inside of noise reduction, the tab itself, I'll modify overall strength, as well as adjust color red, adjust color blue, very, very often. Now we'll talk about this point again in just a few moments, but there is another thing that this image shows us beautifully, and that is the idea of banding or the presence of banding within an image. And you can see that right across here. So basically right underneath where my cursor is right now, there's a nice little bit of a horizontal band as well as some vertical banding also. As a starting point, We know I've hit the preset. I've made a couple of adjustments inside of noise reduction. I might elect to go into detail recovery. For this image, I'm going to skip this discussion and go right down to debanding, but we will go back and hit detail recovery in a follow-on image. Debanding, relatively simple control to use. If you're seeing horizontal banding across the image, then go in and click the little horizontal checkbox, and we'll see if that horizontal band can be removed. And it turns out in this image, it can. If you didn't notice that, it can be a little bit challenging to see on the live webinar. So I'd like you to look right in here in this area in the center of the fluke. I'm going to turn that debanding off, and you can see that band shows right back up right across the fluke. This is something that is relatively common inside of your images, and look for it. Okay? When you start to see these bands, you might not need, I'm going to pull up my presets. Notice that just one of your presets has a debanding option built in. So if you don't want to use that much in terms of a raw strongest, but I just want raw stronger and I still want to do debanding, be willing to use your preset as a starting point. Go in and click whichever debanding box you need. It turns out for me on this image, I kind of need them both. So I'm going to hit horizontal and vertical. The follow-on control in debanding is banding width, and what really you can think of that as the overall strength that is applied to remove the banding within your image. The default is 20. I think that did a great job in this image. If I needed more, I'd push a little bit further to right. If I needed less, I would push back to the left. So in terms of a workflow, we used a preset to start the whole ball, get the ball rolling, and then we went in and tweaked as necessary our noise reduction as well as debanding tab to get everything we were looking for. So I'm going to hit OK and take this right back to Photoshop. And then I want to show you another method that can do something really similar if you don't want to touch the sliders. So we'll let that build here. So now we have our nice noise reduction. And oh, by the way, notice we don't get a huge amount of color shift right there in the center of that fluke based on what we did with the other controls. Now, if you don't want to use those, there's always an alternate method. Some people will find it more effective and possibly more efficient. So what I'm going to do is take that background layer and duplicate it again just so we can have a compare and contrast. So I'm going to put this as my DeNoise Take 2 layer, and then I'll send this one right back over like we saw before. Assuming I can find it. Bring the presets back up, because I'm going to use these as a good starting point. And the one we used last time was raw stronger. Okay. We see the exact same results as I had before. A little bit of red showing up here. I don't want to go in now this time and move any of my other sliders around. Say, for example, I'm afraid of sliders and I don't want to touch them, and that's okay. You don't have to get in and move all these around. But I would still go in and click those horizontal and vertical debanding. Those are relatively easy, even if you're averse to moving a slider and you really don't want to go in and get into the nuts and bolts of the program. A simple click of the mouse can do some good work for you. So with those, I'm getting a little mouse happy. I vertical twice. So we'll allow that to build and hit OK. So this time I'm intentionally bringing back some of that color that blended together in the middle of the whale tail. And I want to show you a real simple way inside of Photoshop to get rid of that without ever moving a slider. So here we are on our DeNoise 2 level. I'm going to toggle that on and off real quick just so we can see. And there certainly is a little bit of red right there in the center of the whale tail. A quick trick inside of Photoshop that I use often inside of DeNoise is that when I use this separate layer, I'll go up to what's called a layer blend mode. It's going to be showing up right here. It's the normal at the top of the layers panel. And I'll go down from normal, which is the default, all the way down to the bottom, which is luminosity. And what this does is it allows just the luminance values from my Noise 2 layer or DeNoise 2 layer to affect the image. So I'll click on to luminosity, and we'll see a real nice shift. So I'm going to go from luminosity to normal, have the red that we brought back. If I want to get rid of it, I come down to Luminosity, and I'll just toggle back and forth, Control or Command Z a couple times. The blend mode being a history state, I'm able to do that. And notice that if you get that unpleasant blending of color based on what DeNoise is doing, it did incredible noise reduction, but we introduced a little bit of color. Hey, no worries, I'll take it. Just switch my blend mode from normal to luminosity, and now I'm back to the original color of the image, and I don't have to worry about any type of color crossover or things that are a little bit less accurate. So there's two methods built into a relatively simple workflow, starting with a preset inside of DeNoise, tweaking it with the right panel if you need to, and then bringing it back over to Photoshop if you'd like, changing the blend mode from normal to luminosity. Then you can get some real nice results. I will find myself, even when I don't see that little bit of color mix, whenever I bring the DeNoise layer back over to Photoshop, I'll always toggle from normal to luminosity and see if there's one that I prefer over the other. I think that's a real nice little tweak that we can use, and you get some nice results when you use that. So I'm going to shut this image down. I'll navigate us back over to Lightroom, and I want to bring up, I guess we'll go marine mammal centric today. I'm going to bring up a porpoise and show you another one of my favorite little tweaks that I can make inside of the right panel to get, I think, a little bit better results when I'm using the program. So first thing I'll do, of course, is take this over to the Develop module, making sure I'm turning off all my sharpening settings. I'll do that here using my DeNoise Prep preset. And then once I have that, I go right over to Photoshop. Now, if you don't have Photoshop, no worries. Of course, you could send this over via Topaz Fusion right away into the plugin. You do lose a little bit of control and a few options, blend modes and things like that, but all in all, that's okay. If you're not ready for the whole Photoshop experience yet, you don't need to be. Go into it when you're ready. So here is our porpoise, and looking at this image, I'm going to bring it up once again to a one-to-one view, and we'll see that there is a decent amount of noise here inside, off to really to the left or the darker areas of the animal, and that's just what I would expect. I'm going to see noise a lot more in the lower tonal regions and in the deep shadows. It always lives there. I always like to say in class that noise is kind of like the dust bunnies under your bed. They live there in the dark areas, and you don't really see them until you crank the lights on or shine a flashlight under there. If we take a look back at at this image here, why is it that I'm seeing the noise? Oh, that porpoise happened to be shot at ISO 100, but the image was incredibly underexposed. So I'll show you what I've done. I've taken up my exposure slider roughly 2, and that 2 is just like shining the flashlight under the bed, seeing those dust bunnies and noise, so I've got to deal with it somewhere. Okay, so going back over to Photoshop. Same workflow as we did before. Coming over here, duplicate the layer. That was Control or Command J. I'm going to call it DeNoise so I know what I'm doing here. And then we'll launch the filter. Topaz Labs, little DeNoise. Okay. Just like from the discussion before, I'm going to go back to a one-to-one view, move the image into what I consider to be the critical area. For me, that's this stream of bubbles that's just about to break the surface, as well as this cool little bow wave right before the porpoise comes up. As coming over from a raw image, the basic workflow, just like we saw before, start with the lightest possible preset you can and see what you get. If it doesn't get what you need, start stepping through those presets, and you're slowly balancing your requirements. Okay, how much noise reduction do I want versus how much detail would I like to retain inside of the image? I'm going to take it down just a little bit further. Maybe go back into that raw strong one more time. Clicking a before and after. I'm getting some nice levels of noise reduction here. I like what I'm seeing. So done with the preset. If you were satisfied here, click OK. You're back. Maybe switch over to that luminosity blend mode. Over to you as to how you'd want to try that. For me, I think I do want to go in and tweak this just a little bit, though. So using the preset as a starting point, what would I tweak this time? Well, maybe coming over here to noise reduction again, the basic slider. And looking through and see what I have, notice I've got my adjust highlights. I really don't have a significant amount of noise inside of the highlights. When I have a very distinct area of highlights inside the image, and I know they're not suffering from a noise problem, I will go in and attempt to reduce anything that denoise is doing to those highlights. So yes, I like what I'm getting from the preset, but the adjust highlight slider, what this does for me is it changes the relative level of the denoise or the noise reduction algorithm on the highlights compared to the overall strength. So in most cases, I find that taking my adjust highlight slider, if I don't have a noise issue up here in the highlights, I'm going to end up with a better result by taking that adjust highlights and moving it all the way down to -1. As we said before, it's always a balance of reducing noise versus loss of detail. Those bright areas of the image, they really draw the viewer's eye in. I want to try as much as I can to keep from reducing detail here. And I think the best way to do that, at least to start, is come into my noise reduction tab where I can tweak with adjust highlights and push it down to -1 so I have less noise reduction going on the highlights compared to everywhere else within the image. Now the companion slider to that one, you've probably figured out, is the adjust shadow. It's the exact same thing. We're looking at noise reduction based on tonality. If you want to go through and say, you know, does it make any difference if I move this around? And let's try it out. The great thing about denoise is everything we're doing here is non-destructive. Nothing takes effect, nothing touches my image at all until I hit OK. So if you want to go in and play, go for it. Move that slider around from one extreme to the other and see what it is that you get. And I'll do just that, going from a -1 all the way up to +1. And notice I do get a lot more noise reduction here down in the shadows. And quite honestly, I find that relatively pleasant there. I'm losing a little bit of detail, but the fact that I'm going into this nice opaque water, I think it looks pretty cool. So I might just pull that back a little bit. Give myself a before and after by just a real quick click, and I like the results of what I have there. So use the preset as a starting point. If you see some bright areas of highlights within the image, consider coming over here, tweaking the adjust highlight. As you start to think that what that workflow is, prep the image. That is, turn off everything that's going on inside of your raw conversion utility that's affecting sharpening as well as noise reduction. Move over to Photoshop, move into Topaz DeNoise, set a preset as a starting point, and then tweak as necessary to get what you need. Now, another tweak that you may want to make in an instance like this there's a lot of detail right up there inside of those bubbles. Our next tab down is detail recovery, and we can go in and attempt to bring back a little bit of detail, and it's a relatively simple slider, recover detail right here. What the slider does is it attempts to bring back some of the original detail, whether it's edge contrast, texture detail inside of the image. To see, really, with nothing, you can take it all the way to the left. To maximize this out, kick it over to the right. Although we can bring back detail by doing this, be careful what happens at a very local level. It's incredibly subtle, the difference that we had there when I went up to recovery detail of 1, but really look closely. This might be a great opportunity to go into a 200% view. Any of your additions here inside detail recovery, these are things that I like to use in moderation and in true moderation, because if I start to tweak them a little bit too much at a very local level, think of it as a tiny pixel level inside of the image, I'm starting to see other artifacts that are introduced that might not be pleasant. So although, yes, I have recovered detail across a lot of the image, I've also introduced these amplifying artifacts in places that I shouldn't have them. So we can go back and use detail recovery to introduce a little bit of detail that might have been washed out, so to speak, when we did our noise reduction. In most cases, though, I like leaving these at the basic defaults, or even more so, turning them off. And then if I need to go in and add additional detail back into a specific part of the image, I will do so once I get back in Photoshop. So I'll hit OK. And I'm going to take this porpoise image back over. And you may be asking yourself, well, how would you put that detail back in? I'll tell you what I would do is take this denoise layer. I like having a separate layer for everything. I'm going to give it a copy. I'm going to call this one detail. And what I would do is go in at this point, come up once again to filter, Topaz Labs, and I'm going to launch Topaz Detail. Detail, I think, does a tremendous job of bringing detail back into the image based on small, medium, or large detail levels. You can think of that, if you will, as what different pixel size or what radius is that detail amplification applied. I'll just use a quick preset here, something that we're going to notice. I'll hit Bold Detail, and yeah, you bet, there's a lot of detail added back in here. It's probably too much. I'm going to overdo it for this discussion. Come in, hit OK, and then add a little bit of a layer mask. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option, click, and I'll just go in inside of Photoshop and maybe paint a little bit of that detail back in here, areas that I want it, and only areas that I want it. If I try and reintroduce detail across that whole image, remember that might get a little bit noisy. So although denoise, I think, has some nice controls for us to recover detail, I like taking care of the denoise portion first, and then on an additional layer or perhaps an additional image, depending upon how you're launching the plugins, I usually go into Topaz Detail and bring back, or attempt to bring back, what it is that I've lost. So we're seeing a similar workflow the entire time. We launch over to Photoshop, separate layers, naming them appropriately, going into Topaz, using a preset as a starting point, tweaking as necessary, and then continuing on. Now, I want to show you just one other option that you have to do this, and that is just to introduce a quick smart object workflow. And the smart object concept, I think, is a pretty good one, because that allows us access to our filters after we've used them. And if that doesn't make sense, I'll show you what that means here in just a moment. I think we've got a few minutes left that will allow us to show this. So the next image I'd like to bring over is just a little jelly here with a couple of prowfish around it. Just kind of interesting nature tidbit. The jellyfish floats around, really can't do anything. These prowfish are feeding off the jelly. So they just hang out around him and eat until they're big enough to survive in the wild, and they take off and eat other things. It's an interesting relationship. So an image, once again, that looking over at my basic information, ISO 100, shouldn't be a huge amount of data there or noise there, but when I look at my exposure slider, I'll see that I've kicked this up over 2, so 2.4. I have shown the noise that was there. It's just like, once again, shining that flashlight underneath the bed. This brings up an interesting point. If any of you have seen my discussion, use that whale tail in one of the Vimeo videos, I talk a little bit about what do you want to do to the image before you send it over to denoise. And we hit that earlier with what happens down here on the Detail tab in terms of turning off sharpening as well as the Adobe noise reduction. But what I didn't cover in this discussion, at least, is what do we do tonally to the image. What we found at Light doing a lot of these is that if you need to make big adjustments to the image, take care of those big adjustments before you send the image over to denoise. What I consider a big adjustment, well, when you're clicking that exposure slider up 2, that's a big adjustment. Really what I've found is if I'm taking exposure slider up more than about a half, then I need to take care of some tonal work first before I go to denoise. If I'm looking at just the slight, my tonal range is good, but I'm going to tweak it a little bit, take care of your noise reduction first, and then go in and tweak your tonal range. When it's something big, do it first, otherwise you're going to have a whole world of problems. So in addition to what we saw earlier on the Detail tab, I did take into account the fact that I was incredibly underexposed on this image, so I have bumped up my exposure value here, increasing the overall brightness of the image. And now it's ready to go over to Topaz DeNoise. Send it right back to Photoshop, just like we did before. Same workflow. Actually, I'll tell you, I'm not going to do the same workflow because I started this whole discussion regarding smart objects. So obviously, we need a little bit of denoise work here. If you're familiar with smart objects, you're going to like this, and it should reinforce that in most cases, you should probably be using smart objects when you work the Topaz filters. If you haven't started working smart objects, this hopefully is a nice introduction into that concept, and it can show you some of the power and control you get here by using smart object functionality. So to take this basic image over to become a smart object, I'm just going to right-click, convert to smart object. Because I already have this inside of Photoshop, it doesn't give me access straight away back to the raw data like it would if I launched through different means, but it's still going to provide all the benefits of smart filters. So with a smart object, I don't need to create a duplicate copy of this layer 0. I can go straight up, launch my filter. So I'm going to grab Topaz Labs, click DeNoise again, back to 1:1, and center up the image to the critical area. Same workflow as I saw before. I'm going to start within my relatively low levels in the raw, checking out what I'm getting. I like that raw strong for a lot of these, so I'm going to put it right there. Hide my left panel, do some real quick tweaking because I know we don't have a huge amount of time, but come back into noise reduction and say, you know what, I really don't need that in my highlights. And for that, I'll say OK. The great thing about doing this workflow as a smart object is once I find myself back here, outside of the Topaz DeNoise interface, well, what if I change my mind? What if I say, you know what, I don't think I have enough, or I have too much, or I just want to have one file that I can use for anything. I want to use it to make a big print. I want to use it to make a small image on the web. With a smart object, these Topaz DeNoise effects are all part of a smart filter. To go right back into where I started, all I need to do is double-click onto the Topaz DeNoise. It launches the filter again exactly where I was, and I can go in and make tweaks as necessary. That is a hugely, hugely powerful thing to have. When I look at the basic smart object functionality, I do have on these smart filters a layer mask, which is a nice thing. The problem with smart filters, at least what we have right now, is that I have one layer mask. So if I wanted to go in and maybe add some detail back into the bell of this jelly or maybe to these prowfish, I would need to do that on a separate layer. Well, since it's smart object, I don't really have that option. But if I went in, filter, Topaz, detail, and I'll just click OK with some basic settings here. Notice that both my detail and denoise share the same mask. Not really going to work for me because I want detail to go strictly onto the bell and onto the fish. And if I paint on this mask with black here, that also eliminates my noise reduction. So I'm going to step back in history, little controller Command Z, and show you another quick trick that is nesting. And I like using this all the time when I'm working this combination of denoise detail. So noise reduction followed by detail, retention or amplification. The trick is this. Once you have your denoise in, right-click onto your image again, off to the side, and then convert to smart object. Okay? When I hit convert to smart object, it's going to take everything that I have, including that filter, and package it in this smart object. So now if I want detail again, which I do, filter, coming down to Topaz, little detail. Similar workflow. In fact, I use a real similar workflow on most of my Topaz plugins. I find a preset that works. I would tweak it on the right. Just for time, I won't tweak here. I'll hit OK. Now I can go into my mask and paint that detail back in just where I want it, which is going to be around the bell of the jelly, maybe some of these tentacles onto the fish. So I've done my 1-2 combo with a smart object. You might be asking, if you haven't worked these, what's the benefit of that? Well, at any point, I could double-click on Topaz Detail. I go back to my detail controls, and I can change my mind. If I want to change denoise, just click onto the Layer 0 thumbnail. And there I have everything I had before. Topaz DeNoise with the smart filter. Pretty slick. I can make my adjustments there. The only thing you need to remember is when you're over having double-clicked onto this smart object, Your workflow is just go in, click File, Save. I can't do that now because I haven't made any changes. Click File, Save, and everything you did there is going to be applied back to your original image. So there's a couple of different options. If you're a smart object user, nest your filters. So you can do a denoise, detail, 1-2 combination. You get great results. If you don't happen to use smart objects, just set up separate layers, one for denoise, one for detail, smooth the image out, bring back what you need, and you're good to go. So hopefully that helped a little bit. I think I'm probably out of time there, Nicole, but it's just a basic launch. Start with a preset. If it works for you, hit OK and you're done. That's the beauty of the plugin. If you're not finished, you think you need to go someplace else, just tweak a couple of those sliders we talked about, and you can get some amazing results.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hal. People are already saying that these are some great tips. So thank you. I do have lots of questions. I'll go ahead and start with the questions I've already had throughout the presentation. See if we can get through them.
Sounds good.
All right. Let's see here. Helene had asked, does it make sense to sharpen a picture after using denoise? And I think you just kind of went through that, that it does.
I think that it does. For me, depending upon the level of the noise, I really want to get rid of that noise first. Otherwise, most of my sharpening efforts are going to amplify the noise. I can get incredibly detailed with a sharpening mask and apply it only where it's necessary. But even when you do that, I think it amplifies the noise. So after I do noise reduction, you bet I go back in and work some type of input sharpening as well as content sharpening to bring back detail that I might have lost.
All right. All right, we have quite a few people who have mentioned Lightroom's noise reduction and ACR, Adobe Camera Raw's noise reduction, and say, you know, what makes denoise, why would I need denoise, or what makes denoise different?
I'll tell you, for my workflow, when I have just a small amount of noise in the image, and as we said before, that's somewhat subjective for how you're using the image. When I have something relatively small, I have absolutely no problem going in to the Adobe Camera Raw sliders or Lightroom's Develop module, and I'll tweak up the luminosity or the color sliders or luminance slider or color sliders as necessary. I find that as I put those sliders to a higher setting, though, that I start to get a lot of, I lose a lot of detail and the image becomes very illustrative. What I like about denoise is that when I send an image over that has a medium to a high level of noise, I retain, in my opinion, a more photographic feel to the image. And I don't have to do as much to bring it back from, you know, having it become an illustration. So I can't say that there are times I certainly use the Adobe noise reduction. It's usually when there's a small amount of noise in the image. When I have something in my workflow that I consider a medium to high level, to me it's straight away over to denoise. I think it does a better job retaining more of my photographic feel, and for me that's what it's about.
Great, thanks. I don't know if you already answered this. I think you might have. As I was typing away on some questions, I may have missed it. But Edward had asked, is it okay to make other global or local adjustments in Camera Raw, for example, basic panel exposure, shadow, highlights, vibrance, before bringing the image into Photoshop and launching denoise? What is your opinion on that?
You know, my take is that it is. You can go in and do that. Just be cognizant of what you're doing and how it affects the noise. Really, you know, most noise that we're seeing a huge amount of with the modern cameras is the luminance noise. And as I change, like I would with my exposure slider, shadows, highlights, blacks, whites, all those, I'm really changing the tonality and the dynamic range of my image. As I do that to increase contrast overall in the image, I will more than likely increase contrast in those areas that are noisy, in effect amplifying the noise. So yes, go in and work some of the tonal adjustments on your image ahead of time, but be really aware of what they're doing to your noise. If by moving those tonal adjustments you start to see the noise become really pronounced, then I would stop what I was doing, take care of noise, come back, and then use those exact same sliders, at that point probably on a 16-bit TIFF instead. I'm going to lose a little bit of control there, but I have better noise reduction. So I just kind of a roundabout way, and it's a very much an it depends answer. But in most cases, you can do some of the basic adjustments to your image ahead of time But if you start going a little bit too far and pushing it to where the noise is amplified, stop right there and get the noise out of the image.
All right, thanks. Let's see here. Beth asks, can you explain the concept of turning off RAW in Lightroom prior to going to Photoshop and denoise?
The concept of turning off RAW.
I didn't know if you'd gone over that, or
possibly what the question is. I'm going to send an image right over to Lightroom, and this is Lightroom Develop module. It could be the exact same, or really is the exact same as Adobe Camera Raw. When we do a RAW conversion, both of those pieces of software have a series of defaults that are applied to your image. Now, some of those defaults are going to be within the Basic tab, adjusting tonality. Others will be in detail, contrast, color, all sorts of things. In most cases, you want to go through and at least disable some of those defaults. And that's initially, maybe, I think that's maybe what that question is going through, and I do find it important, especially in the Detail tab, to go in and turn off the default level of input sharpening as well as noise reduction, although the default is 0. But if I were to leave that sharpening amount at the default of even 25, that is going to impact my noise and make my noise reduction process more challenging. So I do find it critical to go into this Detail tab, turn off some of the defaults inside of the Develop module or inside of Camera Raw, and then start my noise reduction process. Now, you'll definitely be hurting yourself if you don't turn those off.
Yes, especially with heavy noise.
Yes.
All right. I have a question from Alan. He says, on 16 by 20 prints and larger with denoise at increasing ISOs, to what degree, in your opinion, can a crop camera such as Canon 7D compare favorably with a full-frame camera such as the Canon 5D Mark II? I'm not sure.
Wow, there's a big it depends.
Yeah.
You know, I shoot all those, and I do a lot of printing at that size. I think, quite honestly, regardless of the sensor size portion of the discussion, if you're capturing a clean image, or as clean as you possibly can, and you treat it well in terms of making the tonal adjustments, good noise reduction workflow, everything else you do to the image, I think you're going to see equivalent results at the 16 by 20 level out of both of those cameras. You know, if you're comparing 7D to 5D Mark II, 16 by 20 in our experience is not a huge stretch for what that camera can print and print well. But I think if you have a clean capture, they're both going to do well. Now, to take that just a hint further, you know, if I'm shooting equivalent ISOs, you know, for example, if I'm shooting, I'll just pick one, 800 ISO on a 5D Mark II versus 800 ISO on a 7D, I would much rather work on the 5D Mark II or Mark III image that it's at ISO 800. I think it deals with the higher ISOs substantially better than the 7D does. Just my, well, I guess my opinion, but I've shot the two a lot in equivalent lighting situations. So I'm not sure that answers that, Nicole, but with a clean image, you can go crazy with either of those two cameras in terms of a print. If I have to be forced into a high ISO setting, I would prefer a camera that is better for that situation, and I would consider 5D Mark II, Mark III much better than a 7D for a low light situation. Don't want to pick strictly on Canon. We could go that route on Nikons and Sonys as well, but that was the question.
Okay, yes. All right, Richard asks, he said he would love to know how the Jellyfish was lit.
How the jelly was lit it was just strictly the sun. I was hanging off the side of a boat and saw this guy down, so I'm shooting through the water. The main photography at that point, I was photographing eagles, and just happened to look down and saw this really cool, I think it's a relatively juvenile lion's mane jelly. And so I just basically bent over, and before he went underneath the boat, shot it. So he was lit just from the sun lighting up the water, and you're getting a little bit, some of this reflection you're seeing up in the lighter areas of the water. That's actually off the lighter hull of the boat that we were on. So the boat had a white hull, and it was reflecting a little bit in. Just to show you what this, at the time, everybody's seeing it's a incredibly underexposed image. So that was the capture more or less as it's coming out
Mm-hmm.
of the, actually that's it right there. Nice and washed out and blah. But I thought overall it could look okay. And we've taken this, and after applying the workflow, I've printed this out quite large, and it's really, really cool. This is one that, because it had such heavy noise based on how much I had to kick up the exposure, so my fault, I underexposed the shot. Because it had such heavy noise, although we did a great job reducing it, the image still felt a little illustrative. So I took that, and then for me, an illustrative image really needs to go on something like Canvas. And so I put this up in the gallery, and people think it's a painting all the time.
Very cool. All right, let's see here. Last question. We've had several people ask if you use other Topaz products, and then Jay asked if you suggest using this workflow with other Topaz products.
You know, I do. You know, if you saw my list there, I've got all the Topaz stuff. I'll tell you the things that I use all the time. I use DeNoise a lot. I try to be as noise-free as possible, but as you can tell by some of the pictures up here, I do a lot of wildlife shooting in Alaska, relatively low light. So I am finding myself higher ISO. So I like DeNoise a lot. I'm also a huge fan of detail. If I had to say pick my two favorite Topaz plugins, it would be DeNoise and detail. Kind of the reason I showed both of those today. I think detail is an essential one. There are actual workflows that I use that I'll use detail for all of my output sharpening as well, because I think it does a tremendous job. So those two I really like. I love black and white. Boy, there's some great stuff. I mean, I could even get into the wonders of the star effects and all that. But I tell you, my go-to, DeNoise and detail.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Hal. We've already had tons of people coming through saying how helpful your tips were and that they hadn't heard a lot of the stuff that you showed today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. And to those of you who are saying, bring him back, I will try. All right. I'm going to go ahead and steal the screen back from you. Thank you, Hal. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right, everybody. Have a great evening or morning or afternoon, and we'll be talking to you soon. Bye, everyone.